Our next section is called Business Assessment. It covers chapter 4 and 5 of the text. There's three ways in which we're going to estimate the output of our turbine, known as the annual energy output. One of the ways is called the swept area method. We'll spend most of our time there. The second is called the power curve method. We'll spend a bit of time there. And then the third way is to believe what the manufacturers are going to publish. You can probably guess how much time we're going to spend there. We have to know how much energy can be made before we can put a financial value on it. And that financial value will help us determine whether it's worth the investment or not. There's a lot of information in chapter 4. Make sure you read it. We finished chapter 3, and we had a lot of formulas. There was a formula sheet that we looked at that had some cheat sheets for us. The main formula that we needed to get the power density, of course, was 1/2 times the density of the wind times the swept area of the rotor times the velocity of the wind cubed. We also saw some nice tables which gave us estimates for the amount of power that was available. Table 3-2, for example, is shown here. Notice it shows that the annual wind and power and energy density for the Raleigh distribution. Remember, a distribution is the frequency or the amount of time the wind is blowing at one speed or another. I have highlighted the 5 meters per second, which is the same as 11.2 miles an hour. That results in about 146 watts per square meter of rotor. And if we multiply that times the number of hours in a year and convert it to kilowatt hours, we end up with 1,291 kilowatt hours in that area. But that was chapter 3. So we remember the powers in watts, the areas in meters squared, and we multiply again times 24 hours in a day times 365 days is 8,760 hours in a year. Now, we're not going to be able to get all the energy that's in the wind. And this is known because of a thing that's called the Betz limit. And the Betz limit is described on page 56 of your text. And Albert Betz was a physicist who figured out that, I can't capture all the wind, because if I did, there wouldn't be any wind coming out of the other side of the wind turbine. It would all stop at the rotor, nothing would come out the other side. So how he did the math is beyond me. The 59.3% maximum amount of power that could come out is what amounts to 16/27 of the power available at the rotor. Well, so that's the theoretical max. No one's ever come close to it. Optimally designed rotors, as we read here, can reach above 40%, but how well do they last out in the field? So, on page 58, we've got a table that resembles the one we saw back on table 3-2. You'll notice the same information is listed in here, the same first 4 columns, but then we're also going to list this efficiency, right? So we've got efficiency right here for small turbines, and then we also have efficiency for wind turbines. Notice that the efficiency of a small turbine is as low as 14%. That's not very efficient, and that's when the wind is blowing hard. When the wind isn't blowing as hard, that has a higher efficiency level, but there's not as much energy in the wind. The medium turbines, because of the size of them, they're able to harvest much more of the energy. We can see those efficiency numbers over here in this second to last column. Some of the reasons for the inefficiencies, in addition to the theoretical Betz limit, is that the efficiency of the equipment. Is there a drivetrain? Is there a gearbox? Are there resistance issues associated with bearings and so forth? What about electrical inefficiencies? So again, we already looked at page 58 at the efficiencies of the small turbines. So the next thing we have to calculate is the area of the rotor, the area of a circle. And this also comes from page 58, where we're going to see an example of how to do this, right? And it's shown right here. The area is equal to the diameter divided by 2 squared times pi. And they're showing this for a Berge XL1, that's the turbine we have down at the Fort Atkinson campus. And we have a total swept area after we do this math of about 4.9 square meters. That's how much of the wind stream that we're going to capture. So how can we calculate this? Well, here's the formula, right? So it's telling us that if I use the multiplier for our calculation, and the multiplier that we're going to use is wind in miles per hour. Wind in miles per hour and area in square meters. So the example on page 58 is broken down exactly like this. This is the multiplier we use, 0.05472 times the velocity of the wind cubed times our energy pattern factor times the area in square meters times the efficiency factor that we're selecting times the number of hours in the year times 1 kilowatt divided by 1,000 watts. And so when I plug the numbers in here from the book, it shows us that we're going to end up with 1,550 kilowatt hours per year. Now we could use a calculator to do that as well. Let's see if I've got one here. And I do, but I dropped out of my slide. Well, we can still do it. I'll go back to the textbook, and then I'll pull the calculator up, and sure enough, I'll bring this over here. So those are our numbers. So I'll clear it out. We'll take 0.05472 times 12 miles an hour raised to the third power, that's cubed, times 1.91 times 4.9 square meters times 0.2 for my efficiency times 8760 for the number of hours in a year and times 0.001, which is 1 kilowatt divided by 1,000. And when I hit equals, I come up with 1,550 kilowatt hours per year. And sure enough, that's the same thing it shows me right here. All right, so there's the math. As expected, some of you guys might consider using the Excel spreadsheet to simplify some of this. It's a really good way to do business. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now and put the slideshow back on. There we go. Another thing we can do on page 59, instead of actually using the energy pattern factor and the 20% efficiency and so forth, we can instead do what's shown on page 49 and use an estimate, the estimate from table 4-1. Let's go back and look at that. So on table 4-1, it says that 5 meters per second, right here, gives me somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,281 kilowatt hours per square meter, right there. It also tells me that at 20% efficiency that I'm going to end up with about 260 kilowatt hours per square meter. Let's go back and see what I had there. So when I multiply the 260 kilowatt hours per square meter times the 4.9 square meters, it comes out to be 1,275 kilowatt hours. So I estimated it a little bit differently. And that's what they're explaining right here in this highlighted area. That's exactly what we did here, actually just above the highlighted area. Now the last way we can do this is we can use what's known as a class 4 wind site, right? So there's this class 4 wind site that we could use, and it states that class 4 can be anywhere, could provide anywhere from 320 to 400 watts per meter squared. Well, let's read the rest of this. It says We want to know what we can expect if we install a turbine on a 33-meter or 100-foot tower. Well, let's go back and look at that Class 4 website. Bear with me here. So on page 411 of the text, we're going to find this wind class site. So that's back in the appendix. So on page 411, I've got to do it this way. We've got this chart, right? And so notice on this chart, okay, so this is one you guys can look at. Here's my classes. It's kind of tough to see this. So this is my class. Here's my class 4. And what ends up happening is I'm measuring the wind speed at 10 meters, right here, 10 meters, right? And at 10 meters, anywhere between 200 and 250 what happened? 200 and 250 watts is what I'm going to measure there at 33 feet, where many times the anemometers will be located. But I said, I want to put the turbine where? I want to put the turbine up here on the top of my tower at 100 feet, right? Well, because of being able to understand what happens with density and wind shear and so forth, I know then that I'm going to be able to put out anywhere from 320 to 400 watts per meter squared. What's going on? We're going to go look at this Excel spreadsheet that I have. Then I have the same thing. So I was able to recreate this entire table from 411, right? And I was able to do the same thing here. So class 4, the measured speed was between 200 and 250 watts per meter squared, but because I'm putting the turbine up at 100 feet, I will get more like 320 to 400. Boy, that's great. So let's see if we can get rid of that. Boy, I don't know what happened there. Must have double-clicked something. So I'm going to go back now to where I was at on page 59. And this is what one of those curves is going to look like. All right, so that's what this math is showing here. This math showing here was the Excel spreadsheet in that page 411. The second method for determining power available from a turbine is what's known as the power curve method. At this point, Paul likes to tell us that when he wrote this book, there were no government agencies or independent testing labs that would ensure the accuracy of the published curves for small turbines. NREL was doing some of that work, the National Renewable Energy Labs out in Boulder, Colorado, as was a German outfit named, there's a German firm, actually a couple of them. However, the medium-sized and larger turbines were all independently tested, mostly because the customers demanded it. So if we go back to the text now on page 4-5 and figures 4-5 and 4-6 on page 63. I want to show you these charts. Okay, this is chart 4-6. Okay, this is a power curve. And this power curve, notice we've got red highlighted here to indicate that 18 miles an hour here along the bottom. And on the y-axis, we're going to see the amount of power that's available. So, wow, when the wind's blowing 18 miles an hour, I'm only making about 330 watts. This page is just like this page here. All right, here's table 4-5. So this is the same thing that we saw on the others. All right, on that other page, a couple over. So what are we going to do with that? All right, so yeah, it doesn't seem like a lot of power, but we also need to figure out how often does the wind blow at 18 miles an hour. Okay, so this is that distribution, the frequency of occurrences. Again, same 18 miles an hour, right? It occurs, wow, a little over 3% of the time. That's it? That's all? That's all. The wind blows much more frequently at these lower wind speeds, much less frequently at these higher wind speeds. But we can combine both of these curves together to determine the actual amount of energy in kilowatts hours per year to see that, yep, this 18 miles an hour, this is one of our best performers, right? So that's pretty good stuff. So those are our power curves. Now, we also need to look at this thing that's called this method of bins. Lost my place there for a second. Sorry about that. All right. So this is the estimating energy output, right? So again, here's that 18 miles an hour. This is a table that you can create that does this. And notice it shows that 18 miles an hour results in about 327 watts. Happens about a little over 3% of the year. Overall makes me about 294 hours per year is how often this will be. Okay, so 3.3% of 8,760 is 294, and it results in about 96 kilowatt hours per year. So, and again, that's that sample curve that we would have. So they call this thing the method of bins, right? And so the method of bins, when you're reading the textbook, makes you think like it's a whole separate thing. No, that is used as part of our power curve. Notice here on this table 4-2, it actually tells me this is a bin. Okay, and we look at our distribution, which again was the Raleigh distribution that's been mentioned many times. One of the things we need to be careful of is when we're trying to buy our turbines, we might look to see who the manufacturers are and read some of their advertising to find out if it's a worthwhile piece of equipment to buy. This is some of the information that will be listed, hopefully, on their documentation. They'll say what the startup speed is. When does the turbine first begin to move? And yeah, now it's moving doesn't mean it's actually generating electricity. Okay, and then finally, if it's listed as a 100 kilowatt machine, as is the turbine in Fort Atkinson, the large Northwind 100, that doesn't make 100 kilowatts until the wind blows at 24 miles an hour. And as we just saw in that chart, it doesn't happen that often. So again, there's more information here on the power curve method, and feel free to read some of that. I want to go back now and I want to talk a little bit about third-party testing. There's a database by a UK company that I just found over here that I'd like to show you. I'm going to whip over to the internet, and this is the company right here. Okay, they're called Wind Power. So windpowerprogram.com. You click on this top number 1 here, that'll take you to the main page. And I've gone into page 5 because page 5 lists smaller wind turbines, the Evans, the Berge XL, the Skystream, and this one made by Honeywell. And so that's what this page is all about, and it gives us testing information on all of these. It also talks about different accreditation schemes that are being used in different countries. The United States has one. It's called the U.S. Small Wind Certification, which is listed right here. Right? And so that Small Wind Certification Council, you know, it updates frequently. This is an old Proven machine. It's now called the Kingspan. There's the Berge XL6. I installed one of these this summer. There's the Berge XL10. There's one of those installed in Columbus. The Pike is a great machine that we should have bought, but that's another story. I'll tell you later. And I haven't had much experience on these other machines. If we look over here, we can see that the machines that have been certified are listed here. So that's the U.S. machines. The UK, if we go back to this wind power program, The UK has one called the Microgeneration Certificate Scheme, right? And that lists not only wind turbines that are certified, but also PV. Okay, so that's kind of nice. That's what the Brits got going. And then lastly, the Danes. The Danish certification is probably more robust than any of them. They've been playing with wind a lot longer than we have, and so that would be a site that would be worth looking at for any of you who want to do this kind of stuff. So, back on the wind power program, I want to talk a bit about what the information that the manufacturers have listed. Well, here's the Evans machine, right? And they're showing the data that comes right off of their chart. And the company here, this wind power, their database shows the actual testing of this and how well it performed. So that's kind of nice. Shows how well the machine has performed. The Berge XL is a very popular U.S. turbine that's been around for a long time and has gone. It performs much better. So it also has a very nice curve, very nice power curve. And you'll notice the shape of this is much different than the one we saw in the Evans machine. Very well performing machines. Skystream as well. We can see the data on this. And then lastly, I want to get down to this Honeywell. Ooh, this is what we like to refer to as snake oil. It defies design practicality, but when Honeywell bought the company and started distributing it, it had some credibility just because of that Honeywell name. This is the same Honeywell that's in heating, ventilating, and air conditioning. But notice this power curve. Here's a power curve that shows that it's performing above the Betz limit and it's more than 100% efficient. My goodness, how do they do that? That's an incredible thing. So they did some testing and realized, look at this. You're going to enjoy reading this, okay? So they actually installed this thing inside a duct. So they blew air across it. They didn't have natural air. They literally blew air across it. So not the same. So this is an example of trusting or not trusting the amount of energy that they say the thing will actually produce. These hopefully this company's out of business and they don't sell that anymore because it's a blight on those of us who are trying to do this for real. So turbines are listed as having the amount of energy by their peak power. Well, like I said, the turbine in Fort Atkinson's rated at 100 kilowatts. It doesn't generate that unless the wind's blowing 24 miles an hour. So who would you talk to about getting some actual data? In the next chapter, we're going to learn about a guy who did this down in Ohio, and there's a guy on page 79. We'll talk about him. But there's other things that we have to think about. We compare wind turbines to traditional energy plants. Traditional energy power plants can run almost all the time. You just have to keep shoveling the coal, keep the gas running, don't let the nuke melt down. And you can have very high capacity. And that term capacity factor means out of the number of hours available in a year, 8,760, how often is it generating electricity? Well, when the wind stops blowing, does the turbine blow? No, it does not. So its capacity factor is going to be significantly lower. And quite often, it's been criticized that because their capacity factor is so low compared to others, that they're not worthwhile. Well, they're not looking at some of the other things that should be taken into account, like pollution, like global warming, like greenhouse gases. Again, I want to say one more thing here, that Paul refers to the wind machines having a different source of energy. He calls it an intermittent resource. And frankly, I think that's wrong, because when I talk about an intermittent fault in a car, that means sometimes it doesn't work and sometimes it does. Intermittent is not a good term. Variable would be a much better term for what we have as a wind energy source. So if I want to have more output from my wind turbine, there's three ways to do it, and each of those have different pieces to them. To increase the wind speed, well, you really can't increase the wind speed. You could move to a better site where the wind blows more often. You could also put it on a taller tower, or the number one complaint by people who put turbines is they didn't use a tall enough tower, and their next complaint is that they didn't use a tall enough tower. Also, you could increase the swept area, meaning put longer blades on it. You really need to be careful here, because if you overspeed the generator, you can actually damage it. So unless it's a home brew and you're doing your own experimentation, be really careful with this. And then the third way, of course, is to improve the efficiencies on it, reduce the losses, better bearings, better inverter, larger wires, shorter wires, and so forth. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about financial considerations, chapter 5 of the book. And one of the traditional economics that people will always ask us is, well, how many years is it going to take for this machine to pay off? Well, that's a great question. There are other things we need to we are starting to be more considerate about, though. For example, acid rain caused by burning of too much coal, the greenhouse gases. Thankfully, the rest of the world is starting to pay attention to the fact that climate change is occurring and our weather patterns are going to be affected. So just what about those external costs, like increased costs of food or the damage caused by storms and so forth? And then one other thing we can talk about is when we're discussing these external costs, when does it pay itself off? You can ask that same question about your SUV or your four-wheeler or your $1,000 crossbow. What are those things going to be worth in 10 years? The crossbow, well, maybe that's not a good example. So if we want to talk about simple payback is basically the amount of energy or the value of the energy the machine generated compared to the kilowatt hours you would have paid the utility. So that's really simple payback. Most of the time we're going to design our turbines to generate the amount of energy we use at the site where it's installed, and not more. Because if we install a machine that generates more energy than we're using, then we're in the power company business, and there's been some pushback on the utility companies, and we'll talk a bit more about that. So things we need to talk about. We need to consider recouping our upfront costs, which is installation. Installation means the equipment, the labor, the permitting, the zoning requests. There's a lot involved in it. Other things to be concerned. We may qualify for grants. Many farmers are doing this work, and there are agricultural grants that are available for this. U.S. Department of Agriculture is what I was trying to remember. There's a thing that's known as net metering. Net metering is a law in many states where if I generate more electricity than I use, that energy gets stored, if you will, back on the grid. The grid meaning the electric wires. They don't really get sent all the way back to the power company to be stored in some magic battery. They just get put back on the grid and delivered to the next user of electricity, my neighbor. So it used to be, and in some states it still is, that the utility companies would pay for that extra energy at the retail rate. So if I buy electricity for 14 cents a kilowatt hour, I sell it back to the power company for 14 cents a kilowatt hour. Anymore, they're trying to push back and instead only give the person what's known as avoided costs. Other things we got to think about. The cost of electricity. Is it going to go up? Will there be any depreciation available for the equipment that I install? Farmers depreciate everything from the hay baler to the manure spreader. They will definitely depreciate the wind turbine installation that they have. Other things to consider. How about maintenance costs? What about downtime? When it breaks, it's not running. Can there be a loss, an insurance loss based on lost time? I don't know. When we're buying a machine, we want to make sure it's a reliable machine, because if it's broke, it's not generating electricity. We have to pay for insurance on this. So on page 76 of the text, we've got a table 5-1, and on the next page 5-2, which compares two different turbines. One a small turbine, a Berge XL, and another one a very large Vestas 29-meter machine. Okay, and so we're going to come back over here, and page did I say that was? I said that was page 76. Bear with me. So on page 76, we're going to see this table here at the bottom. So this is cash flow for a single household sized wind turbine in the United States for residential use. This is the turbine that you can see on highway, the corner of Highway 151 and Highway V near Columbus. Same exact wind turbine here, right? And so we can see on this that the installed cost is listed here at the bottom of $35,000, and that it makes the electric rate. It was buying its electricity at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and if we can determine that it makes 14,000 kilowatt hours a year, 14,000 times 10 cents is, look at that, it's making $1,400 a year. Well, the second year electricity is a little more expensive, the third year a little more expensive, and it just continues rising. Will it rise at this rate? Who knows? At any rate, as we see this energy rise, we're going to see that if we look closely, we can see that the person put 20% down on this turbine, which means they borrowed the rest of it. So they borrowed 80% of that, and they're going to have a monthly bill. Well, so that monthly bill will be offset by the amount of electricity that they're not paying for anymore. So if they were using that amount of electricity per year, then they were already paying that money every month. And so this is why we're going to be doing the calculations. So we can see this spreadsheet breaks out that there's operations and maintenance costs, $140 the first year, $144 the second year. Stuff breaks. Okay, one of those years something big time may break. I think the numbers shown here are actually quite low. This would be if the homeowner was doing the work themselves. If they were paying somebody to go and do this work, it would be significantly more than that. So what I'm trying to show you here is that these small turbines at this amount of money, yeah, it'll pay itself off, but it's going to be well into this 18th year before it starts getting a positive cash flow. All right, so on page 416 is the full version of this, right? And so on page 416, we're going to see the full-blown Excel spreadsheet, including, if you were to try and build this yourself, Paul has given us the formulas that you're supposed to use in the different cells, okay? And so that would work well. On the second page here, on the next page, this is for a large turbine. This is for cash flow for a medium-sized turbine, 225 to 300 kilowatts in size. So one of these was installed by a farmer in Iowa. And if you go back to page 77 and 78 of the textbook, you're going to read about this guy. And he put in a Vestas V29 machine. Okay? And that machine, this is the cash flow on it. Now, this spreadsheet's significantly different because this is a farmer, right? And he's selling some of his electricity back. He's got depreciation charges here that he's going to be able to take advantage of. He's got tax income, net revenue. There's a much larger tax scheme that he's able to look at here. And you'll notice that this machine begins paying off money in the farmer's pocket in year 12. And in the end, his $400,000 machine, which is shown right up here, his $400,000 machine makes almost as much money at the end of 20 years. Well, there's a lot more involved in this. There's a lot more involved. But this is really a good start to the financial side of it. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. And we're going to talk about the simple payback. Simple payback is going to be cost, $400,000, divided by revenue. How much do I make annually? The return on the investment is going to be the annual revenue divided by the actual cost. And I got a spreadsheet here on the next page, right? Or I got an example here. So if we take the amount from table 5-1, this was the Berge XL, which was installed for $35,000 and makes $1,400 a year in electricity. When you divide that out, you end up with a 25-year payback. If we do it the opposite way and divide the annual revenue of $1,400 by the $35,000, that's a 4% return on investment. Certainly better than you're getting from the bank, but not as good as maybe you could get in some other type of investment. So this is a very simple calculation, probably too simple. Before someone's writing a check for this amount of money, hopefully they'll talk to a financial advisor and look very closely at the investment that they're going to make. So why is it that small turbines don't do as well? Well, relative to large turbines, you have pretty much the same kind of tower costs, same kind of foundation costs. Your swept area is so much smaller on a small turbine that all that cement that you have to have in the ground to keep the thing from tipping over, it's not until you start getting to the larger machines where the cost effectiveness is going to be okay. The one difference to this, rather than writing a check to install it, if a person were to install one themselves and not account for the amount of personal labor that they're putting in, then we can get the cost of a small turbine down quite well. So it's very important that that we site our turbines carefully. We will be looking at more of these types of calculations later when we get to the site assessment portion of our course, and that'll be coming up in just a few weeks. So for now, this is what we're doing for week 3, and we will also do this over week 4. So this is 2 weeks worth of information, and we'll see how this works.